I'm a big fan of old browser games. I used to play a lot of them when I was a kid, and while most of them were buggy or repetitive, they were still a great way to kill some time while you were at school or when you were stuck at home. I have many fond memories of sitting at the computer with my friends and laughing and showing each other the games we found on random websites. But when I heard that Java was being phased out, I got to thinking about all the old games that I used to enjoy, and I decided to track some of them down. I went to Reddit to see if anybody knew any sites that still hosted the games of my youth, since many of the sites that I'd found them on were now lost to time. A few of them suggested Newgrounds, it was a place I was familiar with, but a dozen of other sites also came up. These were smaller places, which made up for their lack of showmanship with a vast selection of retro Flash games. I started clicking on them, basking in the nostalgia for a while, and losing myself in the simple pleasures of these often simple games. I mean, I was stuck at home due to quarantine, so what else was I going to do? And that's how I found ICanScareYou.exe. I read the description twice, liking what I saw, and I wondered how I'd never seen this game before. I used to love the small section of adventure games you'd sometimes find on Java games, little maze runners or exploration adventure games, and this one had a creepy twist to it. I expected it to be a lot of poorly animated jump scares, probably some loud screams accompanied by pictures of the girl from Poltergeist. But I figured I'd try it on anyway. And what did I have to lose, right? I loaded it up, and I was greeted by something similar to the screensaver from Windows 95. For those of you unaware of the concept, screensavers were used back in the day to stop our monitors from screwing up and freezing in place. Windows had many iconic screensavers. One of the most recognizable was the maze that you often saw sprawling out before you as your point of view shifted to follow the runner through it as they searched for the exit. This game had dropped me into a maze with brick walls and a sand floor and an 8-bit soundtrack trying for a creep aesthetic, but mostly just sounding spooky. It was a little different than I remembered, though. The walls were black brick, like a negative copy of the maze, and they were covered in a bright green moss, bordered in neon. The sand was so dark, and as I moved, it made that classic game crunch that meant you were moving over dirt. I could hear something like the wind in the background. As I moved, I could see that the normal pictures on the walls had been replaced with grainy photos of people. The images were pixelated, but clearly actual photos. The strange thing was that they weren't of any, corpses or monsters or anything. They were just ordinary people, some of them smiling, some of them looking off blankly, but all of them looking like candid shots of people from websites or the DMV or something. As I moved through the maze, I became aware of a voice that seemed to follow me. It was just a whisper at first, but the deeper I went into the maze, the louder it became. I would turn around to find that the pictures were still on the walls, but that whatever was making the noise was nowhere in sight. The images seemed to repeat themselves, the same 10 or 12 photos again and again and again, and I figured that they must be the staff that had worked on the game or something. I mean, it was a little creepy having them watch me as I went through the maze, but no creepier than anything else I'd ever seen in a game. The voice, however, was definitely getting a little nerve-wracking. I could hear it now, and it was saying the same thing over and over again in a vaguely feminine, computerized voice. I can scare you. I kind of scare you. I turned the head of my character, but there was nothing behind me. The voice had sounded close, and I assumed it was the enemy of the game. It kept moving away and getting closer, always just out of sight, so I just kept moving. I kept looking for the exit. I kept making my way. There was always an exit in the screensaver, one that made the maze fall apart and a new maze would begin. When I found what I was looking for, it turned out to be the last thing I'd expected. I came around a corner, I heard the voice getting louder. I can scare you. I can kind of scare you. I turned left, I found a dead end. I can scare you. I can kind of scare you. I dashed back out. I took a right instead, and then I found another dead end. I can scare you. I can kind of scare you. I sighed. I turned to face my fate. That's when I saw the beast lurking in this maze. I can scare you. I can kind of scare you. There's a grainy picture just like the others, but this one moved, and it was far from bland recreations like the other ones had been. The image's eyes appeared to leak blood. The mouth crunched as it blared its ceaseless words. It barreled towards me lamely, filling the whole hallway, its face twisted in pixelated agony as it crashed closer and closer. I can scare you. I can kind of scare you. Despite its alarming form, it was clearly a picture of my dad's face. And I backpedaled in fear, running and taking turns at random until I finally came to a dead end that contained a single floating picture. It was the exit grid, but I didn't want to know what sort of new maze it would take me to. It was a crumpled body, a car accident, or a hit and run lying in the street in a squishy mass of broken flesh. It was grainy and pixelated like the others, but this one made me stop and gasp a little as I tried to make sense of it. The body's face was pointing to the sky, its mouth open and its eyes staring as I looked at it, and the blood seemed to pool around it, glistening wetly despite its origin. I can scare you. I can kind of scare you. I jumped as I heard the phrase uttered right behind me, loud enough to make my speakers crackle. And suddenly my POV fell over and my screen was covered in red as the screaming monster with my father's face crunched its jaws over me. I turned the screen off and I pushed away from my computer, suddenly not wanting to see anymore. The last image had been the most familiar of all, and it wasn't every day that you get to look at your own face as you lay dying. The other pictures had been strangers. They had been weird stock images, but the images of my father and I had been as unique as they were jarring. The face of my father had been twisted in agony. The eyes had been turned up in anger, and the neon red blood oozed from them in my own face, and my body had been confused, devoid of hope as it lay bleeding to death in a pool of its own pixelated blood. Even if the game somehow pulled pictures from your computer, they couldn't have gotten either of those from any of the images that I had. No picture of my father existed that looked like that, and certainly no picture of me existed anywhere like that one. I closed my eyes and I realized that at some point it had gotten dark. Looking at my watch, I realized I had been playing that game for 3 hours, and it was pushing midnight. So, shutting down and climbing in my bed, I tossed and I turned as I tried to push the image of that final horror out of my mind. As grainy and as unreal as it had been, it was still a picture of me as I laid dying. How did they have that? Where did it come from? Those images followed me into my sleep and they haunted my dreams all night. I found that I was running from that hellish thing in my nightmare as it screeched and chomped right behind me. It didn't beat around the bush. It didn't beat around the bush this time, and it dogged my heels for hours as I ran through that 8-bit maze. Right at the end, I came to a dead end and I saw my own body lying on the floor surrounded by blood. I rolled my head lamely to look at myself, moaning out a mouthful of blood as the huge dad head fell on me and turned my world red. When my cell phone woke me up at 7:15, it was almost a blessing. I reached for it groggily, seeing my mom's number, and answered it shakily. Hello? Honey? Baby, I need you to listen for a minute. There's been an accident. She sobbed a little before continuing. Your father's dead, sweetheart. I sat up quickly, still thinking I was dreaming. What? Turn on the news, honey. It's been all over the news since it happened. I need you to come to the house right away. I need someone here with me. I told her that I would, and she hung up as I walked into the living room and switched on the TV, wondering what I would find on the screen. It had been a bus accident that had happened about a half an hour ago. Dad, the other passengers, and the driver had been killed when another bus had T-boned them at an intersection. The bus Dad was on had been crushed against a storefront. And the engine ignited. The ensuing fire had made rescue very difficult. After extinguishing it, emergency services had really only been rescuing bodies. Then they started flashing pictures of the deceased across the screen, and I felt the remote slip from my hand and clatter to the hardwood. I recognized all of them. They were the faces in the maze. I flopped boundlessly onto the couch, my legs refusing to hold me up. I curled up on the couch now, filled with a deep sense of dread over the knowledge I seemed to possess. Everyone I'd seen in the maze last night, they were dead. They were dead, all except for one. I had seen my own contorted face as I lay broken on the floor of that 8-bit maze. If everyone I had seen there was supposed to die today, why had I seen my picture? I hadn't died. I was clearly alive. For now, people keep calling me, but all I can do is hunker down on my couch and wait. Waiting for my own fate to come and sweep me off the board as well. So if you stumble across this game in your internet travels, do yourself a favor. Don't play it. I wish I never had. I could understand why the change nurse gave me such a strange look when I said I was going into room 14 to take a nap on my break. It wasn't unusual for us to occasionally roll a stretcher into one of the rooms to sleep for an hour or so during our break on a night shift. We worked 12 hours straight and just take one long break in the middle of the night so we can actually get a decent nap in. I guess, if you want to, she said. Her brow furrowed. Oh, Sharon, he's new. He doesn't know about it, Jody said, another nurse, very cryptically. Sharon, the change nurse, turned and looked at her. Ha, you're right. I guess nobody's told you yet, she said, turning back to me. What? What's the deal with room 14? Now I was curious. He was the only room on the floor that we had available. Everybody else was already sound asleep in their assigned sleeping cubbies. Conference rooms, storage rooms, you name it. We'd roll a stretcher in there and nap our brains out. Well, everybody who works here knows it's haunted, Sharon said. And I thought she was kidding, obviously. I mean, serious people don't believe in ghosts. People like Sharon, who was as sensible as they come, definitely didn't believe in ghosts. Seriously, I chuckled. I didn't believe in ghosts at all. I knew everything that people claimed had some rational explanation. I had seen a documentary about it once. It was fascinating how people came up with things in their minds and would remember them later and elaborate on them, making them more fantastic, adding characters like ghosts to make them seem more exciting. All a bunch of pathological liars like the people who claimed to be abducted by UFOs. Or so I thought. You guys believe in that stuff? They both looked at each other, sending psychic messages back and forth. I'd only been working there for a bit, so I hadn't developed that particular talent yet. Also, I didn't know the one thing all new nurses should know. Listen to the people who have been doing it longer than you. They almost always know better than you, especially when you're really new, which I was. I mean, if you don't believe us, you can go give it a shot. Guys, no, seriously, that's not okay, the voice in the corner chimed in. Lang, a guy who had also worked there for a while. You really should not sleep in there, Jason. It's not a good place to sleep. I usually trusted Lang, so I was a bit disappointed that he was joining in on this apparent prank on the newbie to the floor. Maybe they just wanted to sleep in there themselves, so they just were psyching me out, I thought. Okay, guys, I get it. I'm the new guy. But seriously, I think I'll be okay. I'm really not worried. Lang tried again to convince me, but I blew him off, thinking that he was taking the joke too far. Sharon and Jody had given up and were sitting there silently waiting to see what would happen. I laughed, self-consciously, and went to the cleaning supply room to grab some blankets, and I brought them into the room. It was a semi-private room with 2 beds. They were both clean, so I figured that I would just change the sheets when I was done, and forget about rearranging the room to pull in a stretcher. This would be easier, and I was dead tired. I turned off the lights and I laid down in bed, closest to the door. The room was silent and dark. I let my mind drift off to sleep. I had a terrible dream. I dreamt that somebody was standing over me, watching me sleep. I knew exactly where I was, and I felt awake, but really I was still asleep. I tried to lift my arms, but I found they wouldn't move. I felt paralyzed, filled with dread as I tried to look up, but I couldn't. You could only see a dark, vague outline of something large and malevolent. I heard the thing speaking angrily, and it began to shout, but I couldn't understand its words. My heart began to race as I realized this thing wanted me out. I tried to stand up, but I found I couldn't. I began to panic and thrash around in the bed, and finally, mercifully, I woke up. Realized I'd been asleep and I'd dreamt the whole thing. The whole thing had been a product of my overworked, overstressed mind. But why, then, did I still feel such panic and utter dread? It felt as if I could die at any moment. The room was silent and dark for a few more moments, and then I heard someone clear their throat next to me in the pitch-black room. I felt a chill run down my spine and goosebumps spread across my entire body. The curtain beside me had been pulled apart while I was asleep, separating me from the bed next to me. I wanted to believe it was another nurse that had come in and closed the curtain so they could sleep in the other bed, but I knew that wasn't it. I could already tell something was wrong. I had to see. I pulled up my flashlight and looked beside me, terrified. And then I saw a hand. Gnarled and bleeding, green and black and rotten, pulled back the curtain from beside me. The face that stared back at me from the second bed was not human. It was something evil, something which had gotten in here, which was not supposed to be here at all. It was an abomination, a terrible, wrong thing in a place that should be meant for peace and healing. I screamed so loud I woke up the entire floor of sleeping patients. I ran from the room, falling over and bruising my hip badly in the process, getting tangled up in the laundry bin near the door. I fled and I left the hospital entirely, and I've never gone back. I can't bear to be in the same building with that thing. Now that I know that it's there, I can never be in that hospital again. I could certainly never be a patient there. Patients would always tell us that they had trouble sleeping in that room. I would call the doctor and ask for some melatonin or some zerpiclone, maybe a lorazepam. I mean, only if it came right down to it. But now I understand the real reason why nobody can ever sleep in room 14. The nurse sitting across from me was looking inside the binder confused. She flipped through one page after another, sifting through progress notes and orders. Around us were the sound of a dozen other voices speaking at the same time, discussing patients and their care plans, bed movements and medications, physiotherapy and discharge follow-ups. "I just met him this morning," she said. "I wish I could be of more help, but like I said, he's a John Doe, so we don't know much about him. Ah, here he is. Maybe this will give us something." There was a hastily scrawled progress note from the day of admission that it read, "Integumentary. Midline abdo laceration, incision appears to be infected. Wound covered with newspaper on admission per triage. Purulent drainage noted. Arrhythmia. Foul smell. Possibly old pericardial incision, but no sternal or femoral sites found. Will order wound care to assess and follow." That's it? I guess so. It's been really busy lately, though. They probably didn't have a lot of time. There were other notes as well, but nothing concerning the wound. All right, I guess I'll just have to take a look at the thing for myself, I said, standing up. Is he with it? That's hospital code for, is he going to hit me or scream bloody murder when I rip the bandage off? Is he confused, or is he with it? She hesitated. No, not with it, I wouldn't say. But then it's hard to really tell. He doesn't say anything, and if you do try to look at him in the eye, he just looks right through you. Sounds like he's probably confused. Maybe nonverbal? Yeah, I would have thought so too. But there's something about him. You know how they say that you can see intelligence in the eyes? Well, when I look him in the eyes, or try to, it's like there's some... She stopped and looked embarrassed. Somewhat. This is gonna sound stupid. I should probably just stop talking. There were people all around, but nobody was listening. The other nurses and doctors had their topics on their minds, and they were all engaged in other matters. What is it? I asked, curious now. Her face softened, and she opened up and told me. It's like when you look in the eyes, and there's somebody really wise looking back at you. You know, somebody way smarter than me. It's almost like he doesn't want to look at you because he's off somewhere else in his mind. Or like, he doesn't think we're worth his time? Like I said, this is probably sounding really stupid. Not at all, I said back to her, thinking I would have to go and see for myself. Do you want me to come with you? She asked. It's okay, you're busy. Go ahead and deal with other patients. If you hear me calling for you, just come give me a hand, will you? For sure, she said and quickly ran off to deal with other matters. Call bells were ringing constantly around every corner, and somebody was coming quickly with a tray of food or a stretcher, a cleaning cart, a medication cup in hand. I made my way through the semi-organized chaos and walked down the hall towards room 14. It was the furthest room for the nursing station, and as I walked past a few others, I heard patients inside calling out, screaming, wailing in pain and terror of invisible enemies. I stopped once or twice and looked in to see nurses were already engaging and helping some of them. Other staff members put on bright yellow isolation gowns and gloves and prepared to enter different rooms. The powerful odor of infection wafted out of room 14 as I approached. I doused myself with hand sanitizer like a priest with holy water at the threshold, and I quickly gowned and gloved, walking into the room and into the thick of it. As I entered room 14, I saw a man lying in bed. He was staring at the ceiling and did not acknowledge me when I said my greetings. Hello, sir. My name's Jerome, and I'm a wound care nurse. I'm here to take a look at your dressing. I hear you've got a bit of a hole in your abdomen there, and the doctors would like me to see what I can do to help. Is that okay with you? He did not say anything. I stepped forward and stood at the side of the bed. Pushing the button on the side of the bed rail, I made the whole thing go up, raising it up to waist height. Okay, I'm just gonna pull back the sheets and take a look here, okay? Again, he said nothing. I pulled down the bed sheet, pulled up his hospital gown, revealing a hairy chest and abdomen with a patchwork of bandages covering his stomach. Slowly, I began to pull them away one by one. I watched his face closely, ready to back away at any sign of anger or agitation. Pericordial incision is typically made during a CABG, or a coronary artery bypass graft procedure, more commonly known as open heart surgery. But it is one of severe large cuts made during the procedure. The sternum will have a large vertical incision at the midline of the chest. There will also be incisions made in one or both legs, depending on the quantity of arteries being harvested for the procedure. This is all important for the simple reason that Mr. John Doe had none of these scars. No wounds from any other surgical incisions, and yet here was this long lateral scar on his abdomen, isolated and alone, no other wounds anywhere. The man appeared malnourished and thin. He hadn't eaten anything in a very long time. The nurse had said that he was refusing to eat, and the next step was to insert a nasogastric tube later that day. Looking at the wound, I saw it was macerated and red, wet and white in a few places, pruny, like fingers after being in the bath for too long. There was an odor coming from it, a rank and putrescent stink like death and infection. My job could be interesting and rewarding some days, but this was shaping up to be a hell of a morning. Of course, I had no idea. Not yet. The smell only became worse as I began my work. I cleansed the wound with a massive amount of saline and watched as yellow pus seeped out in vast quantities. Once it began to run clear, I dried it with gauze as best I could. The whole time the man just stared at the ceiling, looking like he was far superior to all of us, like none of it was important. I quickly cleansed my hands with hand sanitizer and laid out my sterile field. I set out my fresh sterile gloves and opened my dressing tray and my packed gauze. Also, I took out a swab so I could measure the depth of the hole. After putting on my sterile gloves, I plunged the swab into the wound and began to explore it from multiple angles, trying to determine its size, width, depth, height. And it was all that I needed, and then I could start to pack it. All the while, it seeped and stank. The wound edges seemed to move and twitch as I worked, as if it was a mouth and I was a dentist poking around inside. But that was silly, I thought to myself. It was just the visor fogging up, distorting my vision, of course. I managed to measure its width and height. I couldn't determine the depth. The whole while, I was observing the patient's face and seeing he didn't flinch or grimace at any of my prodding. I was thankful that he wasn't swinging at me, at least, as some of the others did. Next was the final part of everything. I just had to pack the wound and cover it with dry dressing. Then I could finally get away from the smell of the room. Deciding that it would take far too long with tweezers, I simply used the sterile gloves to pack the hole in the man's abdomen. I lightly began to fill the wound, starting at the outside edges. As my hand went into the center of it, I began to feel something pulling hard on my fingers, like one of those finger trap toys that I'd played with as a kid. The sensation was so unusual and bizarre, given the circumstance, that I was completely shocked. I couldn't even open my mouth to scream. I just tried to wrench my hand away desperately. The thing inside the man's abdomen held fast, and then something sharp started to slice through my finger, and that was enough to bring me back to reality. I remembered I could call for help. I let out a howling scream, wailing at the top of my lungs in horror and pain. Looking at the man's face, I saw he was no longer catatonic. He was staring straight at me now, his blue eyes shining with satisfied intelligence. He appeared to me suddenly like a man who had not eaten for a very long time, who was finally getting a meal. My screams rang out in the room, but I realized with dawning terror that the other confused patients in the room surrounding this one were also screaming loudly, probably drowning out my calls for help. As my eyes darted around the room for something or anything to help the situation, I felt my hand getting sucked in like a ramen noodle being slurped up by a greedy mouth, sharp teeth digging into the flesh of my fingers at the same time, and then were up to my knuckles. And then my palm. I reached over with my other hand and tried to pull my wrist, trying to yank it free. It hurt more than anything I'd ever felt in my life as I pulled against the razor-sharp teeth that were ripping through my flesh. The man's face was smug and self-satisfied, and I felt his stomach mouth pull me in deeper, now ingesting my hand nearly up to the wrist. I pulled my other hand away as it tried to suck that one in too. The whole time I continued to scream and scream, now using my foot as leverage against the bed frame, doing anything I could to get it out and get it away. It felt like fire in my hand, burning me up to my wrist. The pain was so severe, I felt like I would black out, but I managed to stay conscious as I fought and I pulled against the strength of this horrifying alien creature. I glanced again at the man's face and saw his tongue looked black inside his mouth, his teeth yellowed and missing in places. He began to laugh, but the sound didn't come from his face. And just as the world began to go red and then black around the edges, I heard the sound from behind me as someone entered the room. My wrist was freed, as if the giant mouth had merely opened up and released it. I fell backwards against the wall, my forearm a bleeding stump that I held up and I looked at dumbly. The nurses who entered the room said later that they didn't see the man smiling or hear him laughing as they entered. That he looked catatonic as always. What they did see was a hysterical nurse on the floor, weeping and screaming and missing a hand. A trail of blood leading to the bedside into a hole in the man's abdomen, a very unusual wound that was now turned up at the edges. Turned up like a satisfied smile. Imagine hearing that for hours on end while you're trying to get some sleep. I mean, sure, we're all stuck at home and things can start to get a bit boring. I mean, but, come on. But is digging holes really the best hobby you could have come up with? It's been a few weeks since I've moved into this neighborhood, and I can't believe I'm already starting to regret it. I already knew it wasn't going to be the most idyllic place to live, nor was the house itself all that nice when I saw it. But still, it was good enough. However, it'd be dishonest of me to leave without the real reason why I decided to buy the place. It was cheap. Not cheap enough to immediately raise any red flags, but it was at a price that I'd be foolish not to consider. And on top of that, I knew the previous homeowners, Tom. I mean, not terribly well, but he was a good enough guy, as far as I could tell. I really thought that he was just doing me a favor. He also seemed pretty eager about it, so it didn't really feel like I was taking advantage of him. I remember asking him why he was moving. He told me that he'd met some girl in Canada and that he was going up north to be with her. That's fair enough. I asked him about the neighbors as well, and he told me not to worry, since the woman who lived on the house to the right was pleasant, mostly just kept to herself. But what about the house to the left? For a moment, it seemed as if he were taken aback by the question, you know? "Oh, Dave?" he responded after a moment of silence. "He's a nice enough guy. I think he lives alone. Also keeps to himself. Can't imagine he'd bother you at all." In retrospect, it was a bit of a strange response, but at the same time, to say that Tom wasn't a bit strange himself would have been a lie. So I opted not to think anything of it. In the end, we filled out all the paperwork and the place was mine. I have to admit, owning my first ever property was a hell of a good feeling. The place wasn't much to look at from the outside, but I couldn't complain about the interior. Carpets are clean, the water from the sink seemed drinkable. The bathrooms weren't moldy. I mean, what else could I ask for? There were 2 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms in total, and since I lived by myself, I could make some more money by renting the spare room. Quite honestly, it was a great setup. I saw the hole for the first time while I was smoking a cigarette out on the balcony, my first morning there. I mean, it was pretty impossible not to notice it. It looked to be about 3 feet in diameter, smack in the middle of my neighbor's backyard. The shovel that he'd presumably used to dig it was lying only a few feet away, still covered in dirt. I'd seen stranger things in my life. I didn't think too much about it. Maybe he was building a garden or something, I don't know. During the following few nights, I experienced some of the most horrifying nightmares I'd ever recall having. I mean, I can't remember what happened in them verbatim, but they all shared a commonality between them, some sort of vague doom was always looming over or approaching me. You know, there was heavy knocks at my door that kept getting more forceful, or steps behind me that kept getting louder. Always put me on edge. I remember waking up in the morning with my heart pounding and visceral fear overwhelming my sense of reality. I don't know what the hell was going on. This was in no way a normal occurrence for me. One night I woke up just as the sun started to rise. And still groggy as hell from my lack of sleep, I shuffled out onto my balcony and lit up another cigarette. My eyes drifted over to Dave's backyard. I had to blink twice when I first saw it, but I wasn't hallucinating. The hole had doubled in size. I must have stared at it for half an hour as I tried to reel in my disbelief. What was this motherfucker doing? When I went to bed that night, I stayed awake on purpose. And around midnight, I started to hear it. Like a hellish clock that wouldn't stop ticking. I kept track of the time. 12:30, 1 a.m., 2 a.m. It went up all the way to 5 a.m. 5 goddamn hours of digging during the dead of night. This had to be a joke, all right? What was this guy trying to do? Elicit a reaction from his neighbors? Was this just the most obnoxious prank feasible? Well, if he wanted a reaction, then I was going to give him one, and as soon as the sun came up, I stormed over to his front door and I rang the doorbell incessantly. He didn't answer, of course. It's fucking pussy, I thought to myself as I started to bang on his door instead. Hey, buddy, I yelled. Quit the fucking digging or I'm going to kick down this door, kick your ass as well. I closed my eyes. I took in a deep breath, knowing that he might very well be recording everything that I was saying. I didn't want to get in any kind of legal trouble, after all. At least dig during the day, I said in a softer tone. I mean, come on, pal, give me a break. I waited a few more minutes for a response, but he didn't come. I just went back home, hoping that he'd gotten the message. I decided to give Tom a call later that day. I asked him whether or not Dave had done anything like this before, and if he had, why hadn't he warned me about it? Digging holes, Tom responded. That is weird. He nearly paused for a whole minute after, leaving with the sound of his heavy breaths over the call. Is there something you're not telling me? I asked him. Come on, man. I think I'd just try to ignore it. He finally responded. The nerve of this guy. I couldn't believe it. Obviously, that's not happening, I said. If this guy keeps doing it, I'm going to break into his house. I'm going to toss his shovel into the ocean myself. I wouldn't confront him, Tom replied, his sudden tone soft and timid. What? Why the hell not? I asked. He went silent for another minute before hanging up on me. I called him back 2 more times, but he wasn't picking up. I was starting to figure out why he'd sold it to me for so cheap. He didn't have the balls to confront the guy himself, so he just sailed ship. Well, that wasn't going to happen to me. I didn't even try to go to sleep that night. I sat down in the living room with a cup of coffee at midnight, waiting for that bastard to start digging again. And sure enough, he did. As soon as I started hearing that godforsaken noise, I stormed out of my front door. This time I wasn't going to waste time knocking. I was going to confront that asshole directly. I approached the gate leading to his backyard, only to find it wired shut. The hell, I thought to myself. I pulled on the handle, but it wouldn't budge in the slightest. What a fucking pain. In the fit of rage, I kicked at it, causing the entire wooden frame to shake. The guy didn't even seem to care. He just kept digging. It was loud, so obnoxiously loud. I was really nearing my wit's end. In fact, the sound of it was so overbearing, it nearly drowned out the soft tapping that was coming from behind me. Wait, I thought, what was that? I looked over and I nearly had a heart attack. There was somebody looking at me through the window at the entrance of my neighbor's house. My eyes adjusted after the initial shock of spotting him, and I was able to discern a man in his mid to late 30s. He had a petrified expression on his face as he looked at me. He put a finger up to his lips and shook his head as if he were warning me to stop what I was doing. My bravado disappeared in an instant. The despair on his face was palpable, filling me with a deep sinking sensation in my stomach. As I stood there, still deliberating about what to do, the digging suddenly came to a stop. I could feel my fight or flight senses kicking in, but it was different this time. Before, I'd only get that feeling when I knew what the danger was and I could see it in front of me. This time, I knew that I had to get away before the danger could present itself at all. I heard a shovel drop and the sounds of heavy footsteps coming from the gate beyond. I didn't stay to find out what was walking towards me. I didn't sleep well for a week after that incident, but not because of the sounds. The digging had since stopped and the hole hadn't gotten much bigger, but I knew that was just because it was getting deeper. Yesterday, I finally worked up the courage to go into his backyard during the day, since the digging only seemed to happen at night. I tried ringing my neighbor's doorbell again, but he wasn't answering. He obviously doesn't want to talk about it. I climbed over the fence, and I cautiously made my way towards the hole, and at that point, it was taking up a considerable portion of the grass space. And of course, a shovel was lying beside it. I took a closer look at it, and seeing the deep imprints of bulky fingers on the bloody metal handle. And then I looked down into the hole itself. I couldn't tell you how deep it was exactly, however, I could see nothing but the void below, just pure darkness. I went back to my house. I found a piece of rope that I measured to be about 30 feet long. I tied a water bottle to the end of it and went back to the hole before slowly lowering it down. And I ran out of rope in no time. I never heard a thud below. When I brought it back up, the bottle was covered in some kind of thick, dark goo. I just dropped it back down along with the rope. I wasn't touching that. I continued kneeling there for a few minutes afterward, waiting for a confirmation that it hit the ground below. And it never happened. Or maybe it was so far that I wouldn't be able to hear it at all, even if it did. In any case, that little experiment, it brought me no peace of mind. It yielded no answers at all. I still doubted that I'd be able to get any sleep. At the very least, the digging had stopped, and over the next few nights, I actually managed to get some shut-eye for a few hours at a time. I just wouldn't think about the hole. It didn't matter. It would have no impact on my life. Soon enough, my sleep schedule was back on track. My life was going back to normal. I could smile, knowing that this incident would just be a strange one-off in my life. A story that I could tell at parties. So I drifted off to sleep tonight without a worry in my head, and I prepared myself for a nice dream. Something I hadn't had in a while. But instead, I woke up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat. My entire body's shaking. Another nightmare. The worst one I've had yet. And it didn't end when I woke up. The digging was back. Even louder this time. Almost as if it were coming from my own backyard. I really need a vacation. I worked in retail. Working in retail has been hell. With COVID, it's been 10 times more so. But I have bills to pay and mouths to feed, and ain't no rest for the wicked, am I right? I just couldn't afford time off, even though I desperately needed it. Then my friend Natalie told me about this website that might solve my problems, where you can find someone that matches your appearance, and they'll step into your life for a few days while you recharge. I did it last month, and it was exactly what I needed, she said, as she passed me a business card with a website name on it. At first, it sounded a little freaky to me. I mean, what are the odds that an agency would even be able to find someone that looks like you in the first place? But still, day in, day out, the grind was getting to me, and I needed a break. So one night, after a particularly gruesome 12-hour shift, I went to the website to check it out. There were pictures of people side by side with similar, albeit slightly different faces, and reviews from customers that talked about how the program matched them. And it worked out real well for their benefit. I figured since Nat had given me a coupon to try it out, what the hell? I typed in the code and got a long list of terms and conditions that, like everyone else, I scrolled through, and then I was asked to provide a recent photo or take one with my webcam. Once that part was done, I was asked a few personal questions, and I adjusted my radius to within 100 miles. Not long after, the result came back. No match was found in the area. I kind of figured that response, but it been worth a shot. I went to bed, not thinking about it much, until the next morning when I got an email notification that told me there was a new match. Look-alike in your area. Do you want to make contact? The message read. I checked out the user's profile, a bit disturbed at how they looked like me in almost every detail, and then shook off the feeling for a second, consenting to the arrangement. According to my contract, my look-alike would be there within the hour. And to be honest, I was so excited I actually jumped with joy. Finally, a chance to get away from it all, I thought. The service showed up 10 minutes early the next day, and when I opened the door, I couldn't help but gawk. Wow! It's like looking in a mirror, I told them. What's your name, anyway? I asked. For all intents and purposes, I'm you. they told me as I gave them a tour of the house and explained all my girl's allergies and preferred foods. She was jotting everything down in a notebook and asked a few standard questions. Honestly, nothing made me raise any red flags. Either that, or honestly, I think I was just so glad not to have to go to work and have some me time that I didn't care. Now, don't get me wrong. I made it clear that I wanted to check in on my kids at least twice a day via FaceTime. Not an idiot. And the service website told me all the personal information I needed to know in case this employee did something crazy, like a kidnapping or whatever. And honestly, I didn't see a reason to fret. I mean, this was just what I needed, and I was going to enjoy it. Judge me if you want, but I felt confident there wasn't one reason to worry when I grabbed my bag and left. Things truly didn't start getting out of whack until I tried to call and check in on my kids. Nobody picked up. At first, I was miffed, a bit frustrated that they were probably playing video games or watching a movie instead of studying, but I remained calm. I didn't want to spend my few days of freedom fretting about something insignificant. But then the next day, I couldn't get a hold of them either, and that nagging doubt in the back of my mind started to pester me. Was everything really okay? I tried really to not let it bother me, but eventually I just had to see if everything was fine, so I decided instead to call the neighbor. Barb here, who am I speaking to? Nice, it's Mel from next door. Hey, I haven't heard from the kids and... But that was as far as I got. A second later, she interrupted me with a bizarre statement. Is this some kind of a joke? What do you mean? I asked. Truthfully, I didn't know what else to say. My neighbor's in my kitchen drinking coffee, and her kids are playing games. I don't know who you are, and I would suggest you stop bothering us. Then she hung up. That nagging doubt, it had just transformed into a mountainous region of concern. I needed to get home immediately. I canceled the rest of the vacation, and I drove all the way in a single night. I wasn't far, but it still felt like it took forever. As I pulled into my driveway, I felt this strange, eerie, and sickening feeling starting to overwhelm me. Something was not right, and each step towards the door felt like an impending doom. I juggled with my keys and tried to open the lock, but it didn't budge. I double-checked to make sure that I had the right key. Then I knocked. It was cold and a little past 10. The porch light flicked on, and the look-alike came to the door wearing my pajamas. My youngest was right behind her, sleepy-eyed and brushing her teeth. Can I help you? The look-alike asked me through the thin glass that separated us. Yeah, let me in, I said, waving to my daughter. She gave me a look that I will never forget. She acted like she didn't recognize me. Excuse me, I don't know you. Now I'd suggest you get off my front lawn before I call the cops. This is ridiculous. Chloe, let me in, I said, addressing my youngest. She hid behind the look-alike in fear. This is scaring my daughter. You need to leave, the look-alike instructed. You're... I snapped, trying not to let my temper show. The fuck was going on? I live here. I hired you, I shouted at the look-alike. They looked every bit as frightened as my daughter. Were they trying to make me think I was going crazy? Was this just some long prank they were trying to pull? Honey, go upstairs, my look-alike told Chloe. She scampered obediently. Once alone, the look-alike gave me a scornful look. You have 5 minutes before I call the cops, they said. I got a sick feeling that they were dead serious. So I scrambled into my bag and pulled out my phone. I showed the website where I had hired them and muttered, "This is not a game. This is my family. What have you done to them?" He looked me dead in the eye, and a soft, sly grin came over his face. They're my family now. And they closed the door in my face. I felt like shouting at the top of my lungs. This can't possibly be happening to me, but it was. I went back to my car and I called the police. I was sure that it would be easier to just let them handle this. 10 minutes later, they arrived. I told them the whole story. They took my statement, which I'm sure sounded very strange, and then went to talk to my look-alike. I figured everything would resolve itself rather quickly, but rather than just tell the look-alike to leave, they insisted we both come down to the station for fingerprints. You know, even better. I'm tired of this fraud trying to take my daughters away, I said, glaring at them. Then I saw Chloe again, still looking just as scared of me as ever, and I wondered, had he threatened them? Were her and Tia in danger? I needed to find a way to talk to them alone. At the station, I let the lookalike go first for fingerprinting, just for the chance. Tia and Chloe had rode up in the police car and were waiting as I got there. I ran up to them and grabbed their hands, talking as fast as I could. Girls, you need to tell me, is everything okay? What has he done to you? Both of them looked as pale as ghosts. Tia pulled away from me. Don't touch us, Chloe squealed. An officer rounded the corner and gave me a stern look. Until we resolve this, you need to stay away from the family, he said. I bit my tongue. I felt like strangling them. I mean, they were my family. This was insane. Still, I didn't risk more problems, so I just sat and waited as he escorted the girls to another room. My heart felt like he was going to explode as I fixated on my youngest. She had never seemed so scared. What the heck was this person doing to them where they had forgotten all about me? 2 minutes later, it was time for my fingerprints. I went in, I slapped my hand on the device, figuring this would resolve everything. But a few minutes later, the officer gave me another strange statement. That's weird. Let me see your hand, he said. He turned it over and looked at it. Did you burn your fingers? I snatched my hand back and looked. My fingerprints were gone. I think I must have been standing there for a long moment because the officer was asking me to take blood and saliva, but already I saw the lookalike trying to convince the sheriff to let them go with my children. I snapped. You can't take them. I don't know what the hell you did to me, but those are my kids, I shouted angrily. I lunged for them and they grabbed a hold of Chloe and Tia. 2 officers tased me a moment later. When I woke, I found out that the person was now going by my name and they weren't pressed for any charges. But he did file a restraining order. You can't come within 100 yards of him or his children. I found out shortly that his fingerprints matched my own. It was impossible. But true. How is this happening? I sobbed as I came out of the lobby. I had one last thing to try. Natalie, surely she could solve this crazy problem. So I left the officer in a mad dash. I caught up taxi to her house. She was outside gardening. Thank God you're here, I shouted as I ran over to her. What? Natalie asked, shocked by my expression. You need to help me. That website you told me about? The person I hired is taking over my life. He's even got my girls to believe him. I don't know how, but you're the only person I can turn to, I screamed. Natalie processed everything I said. Slowly, her brain clicking into gear as I finished my statement. Then she opened her mouth, and that dread overwhelmed me again. I'm sorry. Do I know you? If you wander out of town, to the farthest corner of Habitsville, past dilapidated houses and a single shack of a hardware store, down the desert road and across the algae green creek, you might find yourself in Shrike. Though Shrike is technically a part of Habitsville, they certainly don't seem to need us. They're incredibly private and self-sufficient. They have their own council, their own community events and festivals. They even grow their own food. For the most part, Habitsville and Shrike coexist peacefully and separately. Except, of course, when someone from Habitsville hears the shriek. Calling it the Shrike Shriek is a bit of a joke around town, though there's nothing funny about it in the least. I've heard the shriek described in a few different ways. Some people say that it's a religious experience, like having a divine calling deep in your soul. They see the journey to Shrike as a sort of pilgrimage, and they actually want to be the chosen one to feel it. Then there are some who describe it quite differently, like an intense howling deep in their head, and as if a creature is trapped within the confines of your skull, scraping and screaming to be let out. They grab at their ears, trying to cover them, but you can't exactly block out a sound that's coming from within your own head. And it isn't just the sound that's the worst part. It's the sensation that comes with it. All those who hear the shriek describe it a deep, terrible howl feeling of want. It's almost like thirst. No water, no tangible thing can quench it. The feeling builds over a few days, and usually by the third day, the person makes a decision. The only thing that can sate the brutal feeling of directionless desperation that they feel is a trip to Shrike. The little village leads them like a beacon down the only road that links them to the main town. Their feet become coated with the same yellow dirt as the path, and they say that when they reach Shrike, all their problems are solved. No, I have no idea what the shriek really is, or why it chooses the people it does. I don't even know what awaits those that make the journey to Shrike, with their sacred talismans or their hands clamped tight against their ears. No one in Habitsville knows, because no one who hears the Shrike shriek ever makes the journey back. But no one is too worried, mostly because everyone believes that it's no more than an urban legend, a prank. Small towns have to make their own fun, and that often comes with strange little myths cropping up now and again. And despite my path crossing with the unusual and the strange more often than most, I too thought the shriek to be nothing more than an old wives' tale. Until, of course, Esther heard it. Esther works at the Habitsville Gazette office with me, in the photography department. She's older, about 55. She has 2 kids who are grown now, and an ex-husband. Her main photo subjects are high school sports games, new stores in the mall, and local government events. Pretty vanilla stuff, for a pretty vanilla woman. But there was something different about her that day. The first day that she heard it. She came into the office late, which wasn't like her, and she crossed past my desk. Her eyes seemed unfocused, her face slack. "You all right?" I asked. But she didn't respond. "Esther!" I called again. And that time, she shook herself, then turned to me. "Oh, sorry, Sam," she said, her voice coming out in a dry croak. "Yeah, I'm good." Though she had shifted to face me, I could see it. Her glassy gaze staring right through me, towards something far, far away. I waited a moment, trying to read her expression, but finding that impossible, I decided to act like everything was normal. "Good," I said. Then, opening the file on my desk, I continued. "I wanted to talk about the Barlow piece you wrote for my column. Maybe fact-check a few things—" "I'm sorry," she interrupted. Her eyes narrowed, her face twisted into a wince. Then she asked her question, the one I imagined she already knew the answer to. "Do you hear that?" I swallowed, forcing that lump that had risen into my throat to lessen. "Hear what?" I asked slowly. Her eyes refocused, and she began to peer around, even stepping over my feet to check under my desk. "It started yesterday," she said, her voice muffled by the wood. Then her flushed face popped up again, and she stared at me with wild, ungrounded eyes. "I thought it was a cat, or I think it's a cat. It followed me from the store to my house to here, and I don't—" She stopped. Her head tilted slightly, and she looked down, listening. "What do you hear, Esther?" I asked. Her eyes grew wider still, and her bottom lip quivered. "Crying." She said it softly, and as she uttered the word, a single tear trickled its way down her cheek. I couldn't get Esther to elaborate. Couldn't get her to a doctor. I couldn't even make her sit still long enough to ensure that she was okay, because, well, she wasn't. She turned from my desk and left the office, walking as though led by a rope, and I feared I knew exactly where she was headed. I gave her the benefit of the doubt, but when Esther didn't show up to work at all the next day, I knew what had happened. So there I was, out of the office on Tuesday afternoon, driving down the long, dusty, yellow road towards Shrike. The cloud of dirt that billowed from my car's tires made it impossible to see more than a few yards in front of me, and I spent all of my energy hoping, against hope, that I wouldn't see a humanoid shape emerge from the dust clouds. And then I saw her, and my heart sank. She looked far worse than when I had seen her last, but from what I had heard, that was to be expected on the third day. She was in the same work clothes as yesterday, but now they were smudged with the very sickly yellow that permeated the ground and the air. She breathed in shallow puffs through chalk-coated and cracked lips, her eyes bloodshot and fixed on a point in the distance that she couldn't have been able to see through the mustard haze. I rolled down my window, squinting as pieces of grit whipped across my face. "Esther!" I called, coughing and sputtering as dry sand bit against the wet interior of my lungs. She didn't turn, and continued in a trance to trudge down the well-traveled road. I could have returned, left Esther out there on that path. But if the stories were true and Esther was headed for Shrike, she wouldn't be coming back. The only thing to do was follow her. Because of the yellow miasma that floated over the road, it was impossible to tell that you were about to cross the point of no return until you were already there, inside Shrike's town limits. But when her feet planted firmly in the brackish green creek, it continued to the other side. I knew we were there. I drove in right behind Esther, my wheels rolling slowly over a makeshift bridge as my eyes took in every detail of the foreign place. If there was one word I could use to describe the community of Shrike, it would be contradictory. The houses were tiny and dilapidated. There wasn't a roof that had all of its shingles, nor a door that hung quite right on its hinges. The entire place was crooked, desolate, and unkempt, except for the gardens. Didn't make much sense. With the state of the properties and the dry, lifeless soil, nothing should have been able to survive out there, save for a few cacti. But the gardens that flanked the houses of Shrike, they were beautiful. Lush and green, every vegetable I'd ever seen in the supermarket was here, but twice the size, richer in color. As though in Shrike, everything is always in season. Esther continued to stumble through the streets. There weren't any people out to see her, though I did see a few peeks through drawn curtains. It felt like a ghost town, with an eeriness to the air that made me shiver, despite the heat. "Esther!" I called out the window again, but she had raised her hand once more to cover her ears from the attack of the shriek. And suddenly, she stopped. I hit the brake as Esther's feet ceased trudging across the dirt and settled at the edge of the farthest street in Shrike, in front of another broken-down house. This one was a sickly yellow, almost chartreuse color, with a peeled siding and faded look to it, as though the very pigment of reality was being eroded with each gust of sand. Though I was feeling that familiar sense of dread course through my veins, I got out of my car. Esther was standing with her back to me, swaying slightly. "Esther?" I said again, this time daring to phrase it as a question. She still didn't answer, so I walked up behind her and got a good view of her face. Esther wasn't looking at me, but she wasn't looking nowhere either. Instead of fixing her tired brown eyes on the horizon like she had in the journey to Shrike, she now was focusing quite clearly on a very particular thing. She was staring at the ground about 3 feet in front of her. "What are you looking at?" I asked her, and in response she took a long, raspy breath through her parted, cracked lips. It rattled around in her lungs for a moment. Then she actually answered. "There," she said, and raised a dirt-caked fingernail to point at the small square of soil. I stared at it too, but Whatever she was seeing was invisible to my eyes. "What about it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady and reassuring. She didn't answer, only tilted her head towards the ground. And I realized something. It wasn't what Esther was seeing that was haunting her, it was what she was hearing. And then I began to hear something too, and for a moment I was afraid I had also been bewitched with the shriek, as penance for following Esther within the town limits. But eventually I saw the source of the strange metal rattling din, though I didn't quite understand what I was seeing. It was a golf cart, old, decrepit, outfitted with a variety of rusting tools that banged together as the wheels turned over the rough ground. It came closer and closer, and I could make out more of the objects, though the driver was hidden. Trowels and huge shovels, pickaxes, even a serving spoon, each hung from its own position in the cart. And just as the cart pulled out directly next to Esther and I realized the common denominator. They were all things with which to dig. An old man got out, heavy-set and short, with skin spotted from decades of the sun. He wore tattered denim and a plaid button-up with a wide-brim hat. His face was lined and serious, with a permanent squint, and I knew what he was. A farmer, no doubt one of the tenders of the luscious gardens of Shrike. "How you doing?" he said with a grunt, as he heaved off his old vehicle. Despite Esther's gaunt and absent appearance, he didn't seem to pay her a second thought. All right," I said, though I didn't mean it in the least. Good," he said with a southern twang, as he began to rummage around his cart, passing over his various tools, but not removing any. And then he peered back at Esther, squinted even farther, then pulled off the trowel. "How's this for you, darling?" he said, handing it to Esther. I started, thoroughly confused, but then Esther's catatonic state broke. She grabbed the small shovel like a starving man would seize a burger, and dropped to the ground so hard I swore I heard the sharp crack of her kneecap. And then she began to dig. It was ferocious, frenzied digging, the tip of the trowel diving viciously again and again into the hard soil. Esther's breathing grew heavy and ragged, her eyes fixed on the deepening hole before her. I watched, frozen, as a tear tracked its way down her cheek, then dripped off the bridge of her nose and onto the ground below. "Esther," I said, meaning to stop her, but I was interrupted. "Let her be, son," the old farmer said, placing an uncomfortably warm hand on my shoulder. "She won't be satisfied until she's finished the job." I didn't know what he meant, but I didn't like what was happening. I could think of nothing besides my overwhelming need to leave that place, but I swallowed this fear, and calmly as I could, I asked a question. "What job?" The man didn't answer. He just walked over to a nearby patch of crops, plump red tomatoes, and pulled off a fruit. He wordlessly tossed it to me, and I caught it. It felt warm as well, the same heat that seeped from the skin of the farmer's hand. "We here in Shrike pride ourselves on the fruit of our labor." He pulled himself off one and took a huge wet bite. "Well, our tomatoes are the best of them all. Go on, try it." I looked down at the fruit in my hand, then back towards Esther. She was still digging, her face smeared with dirt and drenched from sweat. "Let her be," the farmer said, and it didn't sound like a request. He nodded back towards the tomato. "Try it." I looked down at the fruit in my hand. I raised the skin of it to my lips. And though my stomach was churning and sick, I let my teeth slice through. The sweet juice of the tomato filled my mouth, the flesh ripe and supple. I choked it down, my anxiety impossible high, and smiled at the farmer. "It's good." He nodded, smiling. "I've almost got him." I could hear Esther's voice, but I couldn't see where it came from, because the next time I looked over at her, she was underground. The hole she had dug was impossibly large, with a monstrous heap of dirt sitting beside the surface and growing ever bigger. I raced to the edge of the hole and saw her down there in the dark, continuing downward. Esther, you need to come up, I said, trying not to sound as panicked as I was. I've almost got him, she repeated. Got who? I said. The one who's crying, she answered, her voice on the edge of a sob. I didn't know what to say. Then I noticed the farmer had gone back to his cart, whistling a tune that I didn't recognize. He picked up the large shovel. What are you doing? I asked, but he didn't reply. Instead, he walked over to the side of the hole, scooped up some dirt from Esther's pile, and then dropped it down the hole. It rained down on Esther's hair, but she didn't even look up. She only continued to dig downward. What are you doing? I asked again, this time in a yell. But the farmer only continued to whistle, then drop another scoop of dirt on top of Esther. Esther, you need to get out, I called down, the fear in my voice palpable. I can't, he's crying. Esther wasn't going to come out, and if the farmer kept going, she would suffocate. There was only one thing for me to do. I ran over to the farmer, grabbing hold of the wooden handle of the shovel in his hands. His whistling stopped as he wrestled, adrenaline pumping through my veins, and for a moment, I thought I had won, but the old man was strong, illogically strong, and he threw me off for a moment, sending me tumbling to the dirt. We eat good here in Shrek, my boy, he said jovially, a smile rising against his face. You wouldn't look it. We got the best soil in the country here. Our own little paradise. And then as I looked up at him, he walked towards me with an effortless push. He used the end of a shovel and sent me into the hole. I tried to catch myself, my nails breaking against a bit of root exposed on the side, and I managed to take hold of something that had emerged from the soil about halfway down. Esther was still hard at work below me, oblivious to the impending doom. A rain of dirt hit my face, through my nostrils and into my lungs as the farmer took up his whistling as it was filling in the hole. I gasped for breath, and in the moment between me blinking and the next torrent of soil, I saw what I was holding on to, suspended in air. It was a human femur. That was the last bit of adrenaline that I needed. With a grunt of effort and immense pain in my wrists and shoulders, I hoisted myself up. My fingers dug into the wall of the hole, grainy bits of dirt going so far into my nails they began to bleed. Pile after pile of dirt landed on my head as I looked down, and I could see that Esther was up to her neck. She didn't notice, only kept digging, her trowel useless now. Esther! I called again, but even that single word filled my lungs with dirt. One more grunt and... I had pulled myself out of the hole. I ran fast and hard as the farmer whistled and the thumps of dirt faded. I was back in my car. And down the road before I thought about looking back. But by then it was too late. I was driving through that swirling yellow dust again, unable to see the road to Habitsville in front of me. The only thing there was to think about was the sound of Esther, crying beneath deep, damp soil, and a sweet, sharp taste of tomatoes, fresh from the vine. I know it just sounds like a neighborhood prank or something. That's also what I told myself at first, too. Some little snot picking on the old man down the street because he or she feels like they can. But these supposedly inanimate invaders of my humble property are doing unexplainable things. I'm not a superstitious man, but I can't begin to imagine the logistics that would have been involved if this was all some kind of trick. And for what purpose? I don't have enemies. I'm just a regular retiree trying to while away my remaining days in peace, enjoying the relaxing suburban paradise I'd set up for myself. Okay, maybe calling it paradise is a bit hyperbolic, but I really have come to view my nice house outside the city in its nice little neighborhood with my neatly kept lawn and lovingly tended garden as a refuge from the chaotic and ever-changing world outside. I'm always polite, personable with my friendly neighbors, but I'll admit, I'm not much of a social butterfly. I mean, in fact, I've probably spent a significant majority of my time right here within my property lines ever since my lovely wife Edith passed away a few years ago. I just rarely feel a need to leave unless there's some specific reason to. My somewhat exasperated daughter once even called me the little hermit of suburbia, and was only made more exacerbated when I thanked her for what I mistook as an endearing compliment. Anyway, back to the point. It all started a couple weeks ago. I went out one morning to check on my vegetables, and lo and behold, 3 little garden gnomes were already there, standing guard. I must admit, when coming out to look at my plants for things that shouldn't be there, I was thinking more along the lines of pests, or perhaps a weed or two I'd missed, not terracotta statues of little bearded men with pointy hats. They're slightly different from each other, but were obviously made in the same style, probably all from the same set, or whatever one calls a gnome collection. Naive as it sounded to even myself now, at first I figured that they were probably a present from some well-being or perhaps a tad eccentric neighbor. As someone who arguably played such a role in their lives of many of the surrounding residents, I took it in stride and left the gnomes in their new posts. The next morning, there were 4. Again, I didn't think much of it, just figured I must have missed one when I was looking around the day before. But then on the 3rd day, there were 9. They were no longer confined to the garden area. They dotted the front yard in seemingly random places, such as the middle of the lawn, driveways, peeking out from a bush near the front of the house, even one on top of my roof. I almost had a heart attack when I walked out to get the mail, only to open up my mailbox and see a small gnome laid across some letters and bills. At this point, my assumptions went from gift to prank, but I still couldn't come up with any good reason that someone would be doing this, except maybe a warped sense of humor. Inquiries to my neighbors led to only a confusion similar to my own. No one knew, or at least admitted to knowing anything about the gnomes, or haven't seen them being placed. Over the next week or so, the gnomes continued to multiply, and though I'd started removing them and tossing them in the shed before locking it, they'd just be inexplicably back out the next day. I didn't know if whoever had instigated this had made a copy of my keys somehow, or was just good at lockpicking or whatever else, but getting a new lock didn't help, and I soon gave up. I was not willing to, in my mind, escalate this ridiculous battle to the level of finding and installing more secure and expensive lock systems for a rickety old wooden shed to keep the gnomes in, as I'd hesitantly have to explain to questioning onlookers and passerbys. No thank you. I also tried just throwing them out, but as you could probably guess, at this point, that didn't do much. Either the very same ones or identically designed figures would be back the next day, in the exact same spot and position that they were in the day before, along with whichever new little scoundrels had generated overnight. At this point, by the way, from what I could tell, my increasingly interested and concerned neighbors had basically split into 2 roughly equal camps on whether they really were some young tricksters tormenting me in this elaborate farce, for some reason unknowable only to them, or whether my aging mind was finally going to go, degrading to the level of buying and placing lawn ornaments by night, only to forget and panic about the next few figurines that I just put on my lawn by day. Now, none would say this to my face, of course, but the increasing subtext level of my day-to-day conversation began to clearly diverge, depending on who I was talking to. My inklings were also supported by a 9-year-old girl named Lucy, who liked to play in her yard next door or wandered into the neighborhood on her bike. She'd always been as friendly as she was blunt, and openly told me to not worry about the little gnomes, they're probably just losing it. Even as her parents believed me and even defended me to other neighbors, I admired her honesty at least. As if things weren't already spiraling out of hand at this point, whatever's haunting me decided to broaden its horizons beyond just gnomes. The first non-gnome to appear was a genuinely cute little frog in a farmer's outfit, caught on a sign that said, "Hippity-hoppity, get off of my property." I became only slightly less baffled once Lucy explained to me that it's from a meme. A part of me felt better at this point, because it seemed to bolster my theory and hope it was just an elaborate teen prank. After all, as I've been informed from the local news I watch every evening, kids are all about the memes these days, and they can lead to some pretty wild and absurd hijinks IRL. So yeah, I'm practically a youth myself. The larger part of me, though, I felt even more at ease. What's sticking with me was how the frog figure was actually on my doorstep facing me rather than facing the street as lawn ornaments usually do, and even as the garden gnomes had been. As they'd been at first, at least, because sure enough, I soon noticed the gnomes, even the original few, had slowly begun to orient away from the street and towards my house itself, bit by bit, day by day. Their smiles and expressions even seemed to grow darker, less jolly, more sinister. Though I chalked this up as likely just anxious imaginings I first noticed. As they turned to full-on scowls, or the teeth became pointed. The exact demonic change varied with each figurine. I quickly discarded that notion, though. Suddenly the frog no longer seemed to just be quoting a cute little saying. It seemed like it was warning me off my own property. The house and land these supernatural little lawn ornaments were now claiming as their own. Other fixtures started to appear too, each clearly off in some creepy way right from the beginning. But at this point I was stubborn and determined to not let who or whatever was causing this to get the better of me. Not that I wasn't still scared, I guess that it was just, this all felt so absurd and surreal that my mind was barely even processing it beyond the surface level bafflement and anger. So, for example, when wind chimes appeared that played eerily, discordant notes as they swung in the breeze, whether or not there were actually any breeze at the time, I simply put on the headphones when they got too loud or too reminiscent of tormented human wails. The bird bath also appeared, stationed in my backyard. That would fill with foul, acrid-smelling liquid. Seemed to collect the bird carcasses around the base, as the unfortunate animals apparently didn't notice or care about the abnormal water. They covered it with a tarp to prevent further bird poisoning. When the gnomes themselves started appearing on the outside windowsills, staring into my home with menacing expressions, less than an inch from the glass, I just closed the curtains. The picket fence I had surrounding one side of my house, for when my dog Rusty was still around, even spontaneously developed barbed wire. I mean, have you ever seen a white wooden picket fence with barbed wire on top? It looks at least as ridiculous as it does menacing, though perhaps this entire phenomenon could be described that way. I mean, honestly, I didn't even bother reacting to or trying to fix that one. I believe the tipping point for me finally came yesterday, when I walked outside and the bird bath was suddenly gone. In place of the area it had been standing on, there was a koi pond-style body, some sort of not water. The same that the poisonous bird bath had been filled with. The pond was full of inhabitants as well, not koi, mind you, just slimy, eyeless creatures strongly resembling hagfish. Small animal skeletons were visible from the bottom of the shallow pond. I didn't stoop close enough to the water to tell exactly what kind of animal. You see, now I felt that I knew this was really happening. My yard itself was clearly turning into some supernatural or evil caricature of a happy suburban lawn. It wasn't just some case of a weird, sadistic trickster. Because I don't care how resourceful or clever you are, I don't believe for a second someone silently and completely excavated a chunk of my yard, filled it with a fresh pond complete with aquatic residence, stone borders, and small walkway, all between the 8 hours when I went to bed and woke up the next morning. I also finally knew that I was clearly not developing some perversely compartmentalized new form of dementia or Alzheimer's or anything, because by this point, I'd taken to photographing my yard every morning and night to keep track of the progress the denizens of my accursed property were making. Sure enough, no pond in sight when I checked the photos of the night before. Also, as sure as I am that no pranksters could realistically install a koi pond overnight, I'm even more positive that I myself couldn't, potential memory issues or no. So I packed up my most important belongings throughout the afternoon. I gave Lucy my phone number to call if the evil lawn spawns did anything different with me no longer home. I know it seems a little shitty to drag a kid into this, but she was more than eager at that point. Most of my adult neighbors would try to have me committed if I asked them at this point, and went to a motel. I briefly considered calling or just showing up to my daughter's about an hour away, but I didn't want to risk whatever's causing this to follow me to her home and possibly endanger her and her kids. Also, Motel rooms don't have lawns. Anyway, that was last night, and after hours of nervous insomnia and jumping at every noise or light outside the window, I finally drifted off, probably around 4 a.m. or so, only to wake up this morning with 4 lawn gnomes lined up in my room at the foot of my damn bed. This time, I swear I even heard a faint growl or two as I carried the demonic terracotta figures outside to be dropped off and shattered onto the pavement below. Without even thinking, I shouted something along the lines of, "And stay out, you little bastards!" To the slight bemusement, but surprisingly disinterested look of the woman 2 doors over as she entered her own room. At this point, I'm not entirely sure what to do. Obviously, drastically as it was, just abandoning my house at the invaders isn't enough. And even though I haven't been hurt yet, things are clearly escalating. I was hoping to somehow come across any recording of similar phenomenon. I had no luck. So I'm being proactive. I bet if I'm able to find anyone with some knowledge or useful tips for this kind of situation, it'd be a place like this. Oh, should I also mention I got a call as I was finishing writing up this recount. A few minutes ago, it came from Lucy's mother's phone, with Lucy herself on the line when I picked up. At first, she half-heartedly apologized for calling instead of just walking over to my door and knocking because, quote, "well, duh," as she put it. Before I could ask in puzzlement what she meant, she asked why I'd come back so soon, especially since the gnomes and all were still there. After informing Lucy that I was, in fact, very much not back at my home, she said, "Then where'd the giant basket come from?" Lucy, what basket? The basket of fresh veggies. The note said that you were sorry for your erratic, I'm guessing she was trying to say erratic, behavior. Certainly, recently, here's some fresh vegetables from the garden. Some other thing I forgot that they probably just weren't worth mentioning. But I was like, wait, you said you weren't going to be back for a while. So I called and after a short pause, I said, "Lucy, I think those vegetables are bad. Do not let you or your parents eat them." She said, "Well, all vegetables are bad, silly." "Lucy, I'm serious. Go throw them away right now. Has anyone eaten any?" I asked fearfully, just imagining what havoc a cursed carrot or two might wreak. "I mean, we haven't. I don't know about everyone else. Looks like every house got a basket," Lucy answered. "Well, I'm leaving now. Heading back to my neighborhood. I got a cab. Since my car wouldn't start at the motel, it just started smoking out of the hood as soon as I turned it on, and when I opened it up to check, there was another damn tiny gnome underneath. Anyway, I can only hope now that I can get to my neighbors door to door to collect the baskets before it's too late. They might get put away or arrested, but I don't care at this point. I mean, who knows what vegetables from a clearly cursed garden are going to do to my poor, mostly innocent neighbors. That's assuming that only vegetables are inside. I'm not sure about this assumption, for the same reason I'm mostly worried about Lucy. When she hung up, it was abrupt. She just stopped mid-sentence. Maybe I imagined it, but I could have sworn the last thing I heard before the line went dead was a soft growl. Same kind of growl I heard this morning. So, let me know of any potential life-saving advice if you can, and wish me luck. We'll see what happens next, I suppose. Sincerely, Eugene. Hello, everyone. I'm updating now that I finally have the opportunity. For those who haven't read my previous post outlining how this all started, see it right there. Now, as I alluded to in my prior comment I made on that post while I was sitting at the police station awaiting questioning, I was in fact taken in for disturbing the peace or some such nonsense upon my return to the neighborhood. During questioning, I told them much of what has been going on, though I deemed it prudent to not quite focus on my primary theory of supernatural causes, and instead just lay out what I knew and didn't know about suggesting the possibility of some elaborate prank by some unknown party. This wasn't as easy as it sounds, as it was hard to explain the weirder things through this lens, especially since they had received statements from a couple of our neighbors outlining what they'd observed of the situation over the past couple weeks. Apparently fewer and fewer of them find the prankster's theory believable. At one point, I finally lost my patience and blurted out something along the lines of, well, then maybe they're real gnomes, along with a few other possible supernatural theories I had heard from many of you. By the way, to clarify, I was and remain very thankful to you all for those insightful hypotheses, even if the police didn't quite see them as much. Anyway, they deemed a psychiatric evaluation necessary and I was taken to the nearby hospital for a couple of days. After appearing surprisingly lucid throughout my stay, as I happened to hear one of the doctors say, and being as forthcoming and cooperative as possible, I was eventually deemed of sound mind and let back out to my own devices upon agreeing to and signing a promise to appear in court for the incident. I think the medical professionals I dealt with seemed to be more open to the prank theory and viewed my supernatural musings as the confused ideas of a poor, nerve-wracked and superstitious old man struggling to make sense of a situation he couldn't understand, rather than the full delusions of a raving lunatic. Nothing that would suggest any clear psychological issues or make me a real danger to the public, I suppose. When I arrived home, the gnomes and their various sinister companions awaited me, stationary, staring at me as I drove up. I wasn't sure whether to be concerned or relieved at how little they'd changed since I left. Most of the lawn spawn, as I've decided to use to refer to them collectively, even appeared to be stationed in the same locations. Some were shifted or transported to other parts of the yard, of course, but none in any meaningful pattern that I could discern. Regardless, I slowly and warily made my way to my front door, opened it, and immediately noticed two alarming developments. First is the gnomes had apparently continued multiplying, and really made themselves at home, so to speak. They obviously weren't relegating themselves to the outdoors anymore. Loose objects were strewn across the floor, and various gnomes were distributed throughout my living room, on furniture, tables, random spots on the ground. The one was even hanging from the ceiling fan and had the other non-sinister seeming smile of any of the group. Another had taken the place of a table lamp, though he apparently decided kept the lampshade for himself, as it was now placed around the top of his pointy hat, covering the top half of his face. The other more alarming thing I noticed was Lucy. She was standing in the room looking up at a particularly grumpy-looking gnome nestled on top of my bookshelf, before jumping when she noticed me entering the house. Our ensuing conversation basically went like this. "Oh, hey, you're not in jail, that's good," she greeted me. "What? Lucy, what are you doing here?" I asked. "After that gnome fell or jumped on me or whatever, I was really scared for a really long time, like a whole day. That the gnomes were going to come over and attack me again, especially after I killed one of their own. But nothing happened. So I decided to start investigating. Sorry, I thought you were losing your mind at first, by the way." I sighed. I responded that it was okay, and then asked how she got into my house. "Oh, the door was unlocked. Don't know if that was you or the gnomes. When I came in, these guys had already taken over by the looks of it," Lucy responded in a noticeably unfazed tone. "Your parents know you're here?" I asked next. "Of course not," she remarked in a similarly unworried tone. "They think I'm just riding my bike around as usual. I didn't lie to them." She broke in, as I must have looked like I was about to admonish her, and I was. "I made sure to ride my bike here instead of walking, so I wasn't being a liar if I didn't have to. Anyway, let me tell you what I found so far," she exclaimed. I didn't stop her. Decided to hold on to my questions and admonishments for now, since I did genuinely want to know what she discovered in her admittedly ill-advised investigation. "First thing is, I think the gnomes are in charge. Like, I bet they're behind the other stuff, like the other lawn decorations and the death lake, you know? The gnomes are the only ones that have come inside the house, for example. Also, they don't move when anyone's looking at them. Not even sure they can. When I got attacked, it was from behind. And when I turned to see, he suddenly stopped moving, and I was able to just pick him up and throw him. Since I came here, I've seen them in different places, but never seen them actually move to those places. For safety, though, I've been holding this in front of me as I walk around," she said as she held up a handheld mirror. She really is a clever girl. "Anyway, yeah," she continued. "They seem to have different jobs, kind of like the ants I've been learning about in science class. Hard to figure out much so far, since I can't watch them while they're doing anything, but the ones outside seem to be like guards. Most of the ones in here are probably workers or some sort, and a few seem to be helpers to the queen.
Queen?
Oh yeah, maybe I should say king, but I like my art comparison better, so I'm gonna stick with queen.
Comparison, I corrected, but she ignored me and went on.
Besides, for all we know, some of these guys could be girls. Maybe girl gnomes have beards too. Here, follow me, I'll show you, she said as she walked towards the bedroom. With a sense of dread, I followed her to my bedroom, only to see the bed had been converted into some sort of pillow and blanket fort-looking structure, with a small love seat from my living room placed right in the middle of the bed, adorned with sheets, cloths, and scattered jewelry from my departed wife. Neatly lining the top were a series of bird and squirrel skulls. I briefly wondered how the gnomes had managed to move all this, especially the love seat, before I noticed a series of makeshift rope pulleys that had been installed into the walls and ceiling. A makeshift platform made of my antique dining room table, its cylindrical legs chopped off and placed underneath for that apparent use as rolling logs. On the bizarre throne of fabric and furniture sat an admittedly regal-looking gnome, somewhat larger and more polished-looking than the others. It barely even looked undersized for the chair. As Lucy had alluded to, several gnomes were stationed around the queen like attendants. This ruler of the gnome colony appeared to glare piously toward us in the doorway with a dark and menacing expression on its face, after staring dumbfounded at what had become of what used to be my bedroom. I snapped out of my stupor and turned to the over-curious, under-cautious child next to me. Okay, Lucy. You should not be here. This looks dangerous, even if they can't move while being observed. Go home right now. Lucy opened her mouth as if to protest, but then, to my surprise, she just sighed as if she'd been expecting this. All right, Mr. Eugene, but you have to keep me updated on what happens. That reminds me, see this? She said as she pulled out a walkie-talkie. My parents really don't want me talking to you much anymore, so I borrowed these from my friend Sarah. I tried to put on my best solemn and wise grandfather demeanor, and instead just said, Lucy, do you understand how suspicious it would look if your parents or anyone else discovered you secretly communicating with the old man of questionable sanity that was arrested on your doorstep days before? We could both be in a lot of trouble. Mainly me, I thought, but didn't say. Don't worry. I'll only use it with either my parents aren't home or I'm outside. I checked the ranges, though. And you're going to want to keep it to the side of the house, close to mine. Unfortunately, that's the side, obviously. But I'm sure that you'll get used to them, she said, gesturing to the inexplicable collection of garden gnomes that had made a throne room where I sleep. She was already walking towards the front door, even though she hadn't actually given me one. I told her that I couldn't accept one of her walkie-talkies, only for her to tell me which drawer she'd left mine in as she walked out of the house and closed the door. Honestly, after that, I just stood there for a short while, taking in the situation and wondering what I was going to do. Then I realized I'd forgotten something important to ask Lucy. Checking to make sure her parents weren't home, seeing only the car of the older cousin, who often babysat, I said some regretfully vulgar words to myself, grabbed the walkie-talkie from the drawer that Lucy had mentioned, and turned on the device and called Lucy. Well, 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 she said with a dramatic triumph a child feels when she feels smarter than an adult. Thankfully, she didn't stretch it out too long. So soon, Mr. Eugene. All right, what's up? I forgot to ask. Did anything happen with the baskets the other neighbors got? I hadn't been able to find much out from the police. I did mention it when recounting what Lucy told me, but was afraid to inquire too far since I didn't want them to think that I had tried to poison my neighbors or something. No one ever mentioned them again to me, so I assumed nothing especially horrible had happened, but I wanted to be sure. Lucy answered. Oh, those? Yeah, I don't think most people even took up or kept theirs, especially after your episode, as Daddy calls it. If they were anything like our basket, the vegetables smelled kind of rotten. I actually took in ours to use them for a prank on my cousin. I think I saw the Harlans throw theirs in the trash outside. Maybe everyone else did too. I could hope that she was right. Still didn't understand how the gnomes and their tools and schemes really worked. But the gnomes that attacked Lucy didn't do so until she brought the basket inside to go through. Who knows? Maybe that gnome was just a one-off thing. So I thanked Lucy, cut off the conversation, still not wanting to use the walkie-talkie any more than necessary. As I turned to put the device back in the drawer, I thought better of it once seeing that most of the gnomes in the room had turned towards me when I wasn't facing them. Otherwise hadn't moved. I decided it was probably better not to leave it there, and placed it in my pocket. At this point, I started trying many of you all's suggested fixes from the comments and messages that resulted from my prior post. I scattered horseshoes and certain crystals around the house, I burned some sage, incense, and other such herbs suggested to me, and I salted the doorways and the koi pond outside. At this point, the koi pond had grown, as had the hagfish-type creatures inside. Weird, unidentifiable white crustaceans also flitted around the edges. The nearest tree had deformed into a leafless, gnarled mass that leaned over the pond. It's covered with those wailing wind chimes. A little windmill had also popped up next to the pond, but the blades visibly had blood on the edges. I elected not to investigate that particular development much closely. I walked over to my garden, though it was clearly their garden now. None of the plants looked remotely similar to when I'd grown them. The leaves had mostly turned a sickly teal or grayish purple, and leaves were chaotic shapes. The tomatoes were actually even brighter red than before, but apparently fleshier and seemed to faintly beat like a heart. I wondered if the gift baskets had contained vegetables more like these. I poured salt over the plants and surrounding earth, then made my way back to the front door. It was locked. Luckily, I had a key, and it seemed the gnomes and other lawn spawns did not yet wield the power of a locksmith, so I easily opened the door. As I entered, I noticed a new fixture in my living room, a note with the message, "Not welcome," crudely written, and the note pinned to the wall with a large kitchen knife. Every gnome in the room now faced the front door with a scowl on their face. I could see that the salt, horseshoes, and so on had not immediately deterred the invaders. I decided not to push my luck further and heeded their warning, at least temporarily. It looked like I really was going to have to call the professionals. After briefly telling Lucy through the walkie-talkie that I was leaving again, and making her promise absolutely not to investigate the house while I was gone, and tossing out the 20 or so plastic flamingos that just randomly appeared inside my car at some point during all this, I drove to a hotel. I decided on a nicer one this time, closer to my house in case I needed to go back on short notice for any reason. And then I sat down and perused the internet for various religious and supernatural professionals that might be willing to help with my situation. I wanted to cover as much possible ground as possible. So I've already reached out to priests, priestesses of various religions, a psychic or two, even a ghost hunter in my area. I'm even thinking that I might arrange for all of them to come at the same time, though I could use some guidance on whether that's a good idea or not, as well as if there's any kind of professional worth contacting. Either way, I want this handled as soon as feasibly possible because I'm afraid of the increasing spread and power. Especially since, as I was leaving the neighborhood this time, I noticed something. A new pair of garden gnomes in the Joneses' yard, clearly styled from the same set. I hope it's not too late for me or them, but I get the feeling that this may all be over sooner rather than later, one way or another. Best wishes, Eugene. Hello, my handful of friends on this community. It's Eugene again. I've come here to share how the situation with the evil lawn spawns developed, and boy, have there been some developments. If you're not caught up, and you could use a refresher, my first 2 posts can be found here. Anyway, I want to thank all of you for your kindness and your informative and helpful advice. After reaching out to various individuals who might have knowledge or experience, even tangentially related to whatever's going on with the garden gnomes, invaders, and their minions, I was able to get 3 individuals more cut out for this than me to agree to help me out, and do their best at least. First was a Wiccan priestess by the name of Arabelle,
who claimed to have particular experience in dealing with Fae. A somewhat classic hippie type, if I had ever seen one. She was one of the warmest and friendliest personalities I might have ever come across, right up until the subject of Fae comes up, wherein she adopts a very serious and solemn demeanor, with an almost disconcerting speed. If these garden gnomes really are gnomes, then this is exactly the kind of person I needed. I'm also able to procure the assistance of local academics specializing in North European mythology and folklore, through a mutual friend who teaches anthropology at a nearby university. Professor Reynolds seemed to be a gruff, nonsense sort of person from our initial conversations, but also a very deeply informed one, which is what mattered. Now, while the gnome hypothesis seemed perhaps the most likely explanation, I was not willing to rule anything out at this point. When seeking out spiritual leaders or professionals of various faiths and creds, I did relate my story to the priest at the local Catholic church this past Sunday. While I didn't expect much, he was surprisingly open-minded and receptive, put me in contact with someone from his order, with supernatural experience, so to speak. Think blessing houses claimed as haunted, even assisting in an exorcism or two, while the idea of demonic nature or some other similar dark ritual origins had me actually rooting for them to be just real gnomes again. Not ready to rule anything out at this point. Arabelle and the priest Father Jacob had no issues coming by concurrently, which was a relief to me as I wasn't sure how many chances I'd get to try whatever methods in order to take back my home if they didn't. Professor Reynolds would agree only to a live video call once there. It would not accompany us in person. She bluntly explained that while she was still somewhat skeptical, she did not want to be there in person if the gnomes turned out to be real, and was sure that she could just or at least almost as helpfully, virtually, as she could be in person, especially since I already had 2 other people coming along. I believe her particular words were along the lines of, quote, "No need for a 4th person to be put in any real significant danger." When I asked in an alarmed tone if gnomes would really be so dangerous that she was too scared to seize the opportunity to observe one of the major points of her life's research, she simply replied, "Potently," and did not elaborate further. I decided not to push the subject. When the time came, Arabelle and Father Jacob met me at the beginning of the cul-de-sac, where my home is located. Worryingly, they both told me they had noticed a couple of other houses with a couple of almost identical garden gnomes in their yard. After appropriate instructions, I double-checked a short list of things that I might need based on suggestions of Arabelle, Professor Reynolds, and several helpful Redditors. A copy of the deed of the property to demonstrate my true and rightful ownership, a small gift such as a garden implement, some wine, a basket of mushrooms, and a few bags of raw gemstones and crystals, the exact types chosen by Arabelle, not me, brought to give as tokens of relatively goodwill. In my inner jacket pocket, I carried a small mallet, in case of goodwill failed, and items and substances that could be protective against gnomes or whatever supernatural entity these creatures turned out to be. For example, salt, horseshoes, etc. Arabelle gave me silver jewelry and a shawl of some sort covered with glyphs and defensive wards. Father Jacob gave me some holy water and a small Bible. As we then approached my home, I noticed more changes to the yard than there had been the last time I was there. Much of the grass even greener than before, but the lawn was straighted with patches of unhealthy, even unnatural colors ranging from grayish blue to sickly yellow-white, to what I can only describe as a vibrant dark brown. The shrubbery near my porch had devolved into similar color schemes and are almost unrecognizable. New macabre lawn ornamentation had appeared as well, including hideous stone gargoyles on each side of the door and porch, and lawn flamingos like those that had generated in my car previously, but now with patches of plastic flesh missing to show the skeletons inside, dotted with grass. Even much of the already existing fixtures had progressed to even more twisted versions. The screeching wind chimes that had grown to the size of small organ pipes and appeared ready to cause the branch they were hanging from to snap at any moment. The picket fence that had spawned barbed wire had also grown, It was now wrapped around the entire front yard, and even the boards themselves appeared to have grown sharp, thorn-like spikes. The hagfish pond in the backyard, meanwhile, had expanded further, now reaching into the side yard. One could even see the edge of some asymmetrical dark gray stone fountain, with the cloudy yellowish acid water flowing down the levels, an ominous mist floating above the fluid. Overall, my property now looked like some kind of garish Halloween haunted house attraction, and I hope that no neighbors have been given much trouble by the gnomes if anyone had come to my door complaining about scared children, impact on nearby property values, etc. At that thought, I glanced at the mailbox, thinking to check for angry letters or something, but quickly abandoned this impulse upon seeing a note taped to the door. Warning, huge angry wasp nest inside, scribbled on, most likely from our poor mailman Fred. I sighed and turned back towards the house. After some fumbling with my phone, Arabelle patiently demonstrated for me how to use the FaceTime, and so I called Professor Reynolds to show her the scene. Any remaining skepticism appeared to melt away into concern in her expression as I panned around the yard. A similar change had already occurred moments before on Father Jacob's face. Arabelle, however, had shown no signs of surprise or worry, but looking over the scene with a stoic expression I couldn't quite figure out how to interpret. She spoke first as we started towards the front door. "It looks dark. If these really are earth spirits, they're corrupted somehow. I get the sense that these progressively more eerie installations, and indeed likely even their appearance, are stereotypically terracotta garden gnomes in the first place, could be intentional mockeries or perversions of many standard elements of modern human homes and their surrounding yards." Professor Reynolds continued the line of thought out loud from the smartphone device in my hand. "I think Arabelle is definitely onto something. Many of the ways we portray nature spirits and elementals varies from culture to culture, though analogs are common across many. Perhaps this warped version of classic suburban middle-class home is an inversion of that, so to speak. Them representing themselves to us by warped versions of our own culture tropes. I'm curious to see the inside." Father Jacob just stood quietly, solemnly staring at the door. All he added was, "Whatever they are, they do not appear to be benevolent beings." Then he made the sign of the cross, muttering a quick prayer and opening the door. Inside, an amount of gnomes I can only describe as too damn many, please forgive me the harsh language, were scattered around my living room, standing on furniture and belongings which had been moved to new, somewhat nonsensical locations and or orientations. The ceiling fan now was placed on the wall, somehow still hooked up to the internal wiring, or running on gnome magic, who even knows anymore, as it slowly cycled sideways through the air like some sort of bizarro windmill. Chairs and tables had their legs sawn off, presumably to be lower to the ground. My couch had been turned upside down and against the wall, creating a small cave-like area that I certainly did not want to go to check further on. Most notably were the large mushrooms of various shapes and colors that had sprouted from the walls and carpet, as if from the forest floor itself. I sighed again. Without stopping to investigate and infuriate myself further, I turned and walked down the hall towards my bedroom. After a second, I heard Arabelle and Dr. Jacob behind me. "If one of you could walk backwards, so as to keep the area behind you in sight," Professor Reynolds reminded us from the comfort of her own non-gnome-infested home, while none of the three people helping me with my situation had a ready explanation for the apparent immobility of the gnomes while being observed. As long as it appeared to hold, we were certainly going to take advantage of it. I reached the door to the master bedroom, and heard indecipherable noises on the other side. I hesitated, but then opened the door as the noise immediately ceased as I entered the room. While the changes to the bedroom were milder in comparison to the living room, that was probably because it had already been significantly altered into the makeshift throne room the last time I was there. Our eyes were immediately pulled to the center of my bed, with a love-seat throne stationed on top containing an especially regal but menacing-looking gnome wearing a crown of sorts made of 2 antlers affixed to a rough circle. Where they got the antlers, I have no idea. I might have imagined it, but the king gnome, or queen if you prefer Lucy's no-men culture, even looked bigger than before, now almost as large as a human adult. The room was filled with various workers and attendant gnomes in various positions, some holding random objects from my home of unknown purposes. I tried to make my old meek, shaky voice in a bold pronouncement of sorts, with admittedly minimal success. This is my home, my property, my house. Quarter or visitation of any sort is neither requested nor freely given. I demand the withdrawal of all beings currently taking residence in this abode, as is my right. However, I want no undue hostility. Whatever circumstances led up to this are in the past, and I humbly ask your forgiveness for any offense unintentionally given to you, just as I'm willing to forget the offense done unto me, whether unintentional or otherwise. Also, we bring gifts as a gesture of our diplomatic desires. I laid down my basket with trembling hands as I said the last part. We'd carefully gone over the verbiage beforehand, and thought that I was nervous about the initial proclamation. Arabelle said I needed to be the one to make the statement to the intruders. Luckily, I was fairly confident I'd gotten a decent portion of it correct. I looked over and saw the clearly uneasy look on Arabelle's face. Hoped it was already there before. After a long, uncertain couple of moments, my proclamation was answered by an eerie, gravelly voice in my head. Your gifts, meager as they may be, are accepted. Your demands, however, are not. I glanced at my companions to see whether I was the only one to hear the mental voice. I wasn't, judging by their shocked expressions. The voice continued for a few seconds. Here, which you claim as your own, is rightfully ours. Has been for centuries. Your kind negotiated with us long ago only to curse us, and we demanded our rightful payment for their continued right to coexist with here. I stood there, shocked and unsure of what to say. It was actually Professor Reynolds who spoke up next, quite an unsettling development, since it seemed to imply that the voice must have reached into her mind as well, despite her not even being physically here with us. I believe I can safely say none of us are aware of this curse or prior negotiation. Who of our kind, as you put it, made such a pact, and when?
Humans always forget their sacred oaths. Almost 5 centuries ago, a tribe of humans began to settle on this land, which had been occupied by my clan for millennia. Other groups had come before, but quickly respected our wishes and left upon us, making our presence known, shall we say. This group was different. Besides being different in looks, in custom, in ways obvious even to us, they refused to leave in the face of our warning. After some battle with the encroachers, with casualties on both sides, we agreed to cease fire based on the following pact. We would allow them to remain and occupy the surface. In return, for annual offerings we deal fairly, and the price was not at all unmanageable. 25 barrels of ale, 25 jars of honey, and 50 buckets of certain metal ores such as copper that are not present in this area, but which they clearly had access to from elsewhere, and just one of their offspring.
The offspring? As in human children? What would you want them for? I blurted out, afraid of whatever horrible answer I was probably about to hear.
Blood sacrifices are a potent source of power, one which my clan is not above utilizing, especially from the young and especially lesser beings like yourself. Again, We only require 1 a year, yet even that was apparently too much for the greedy humans with whom we had generously shared our land. They soon stopped providing this portion of their payment, and even denying to attempt to make up for it with extra metal. This last sentence was said with increased anger and intensity, and was unbearably loud by the last few words. After a short pause, the mental voice continued, at its original tone and intensity. As was our right, we responded to this brazen breach of the pact by taking 2 young humans the following night. 1 to meet the original requirement, and another for the attempt to circumvent it. Another voice in my head, higher pitched, but equally guttural, resumed from another gnome, continuing from here. The humans were angry at the disappearance of their young, and demanded to meet to discuss matters. After agreeing to this, we met with a couple of representatives of their village. The humans pathetically pleaded for their children back, and for us to accept any offerings to replace the blood sign. Even though they clearly understood the power of blood magic and the lack of any suitable replacement. We declined, of course. The original voice broke back in. However, in a disastrous moment of inexplicable weakness, my predecessor in leading this clan took pity on the humans and agreed to forgive the attempted avoidance of the most important aspect of their payment by returning 1 of the children taken. When the time came the following year, the same child had returned and brought forth as the offering, accompanied as usual by adults carrying the other portions of the agreed-upon payment. Notably, however, one of the humans, an older woman that we could not recall seeing among the settlement before, was among the party this time. She carried beside her the sleeping child. A third voice broke in now. As those of us sent to retrieve the offerings watched, the old woman began to recite something in some strange language we did not understand. Before we could enter her mind to make sense of what she was saying, she suddenly pulled out an obsidian knife and stabbed the child in her arm. Now speaking the usual tongue of local humans, she shouted to all who could hear that as both sides had broken the pact the year before, it was their right to nullify the agreement and resume hostilities. The witch, as we could now clearly recognize her to be, then stated that the blood sacrifice of the returned child was to initiate a curse on our clan, as we had taken the child right under the watch of the helpless men and women of the village. We would henceforth be unable to directly act in the presence of, or directly against your kind, or even so much as move, whilst being seen by human eyes. We were forced to retreat further into the earth to avoid even unintentional proximity to your people. We each took a moment to digest this information. Father Jacob eventually spoke up to ask, "What changed then? Why have you targeted this poor man, ignorant of any of what you claimed to happen, and innocent of any transgression against your clan?" "No human is innocent," the original gnome's voice boomed in our heads. "Your people's failure to adequately pass on the relevant history is not any concern of ours, and regardless, his home sits directly on the center of our clan's rightful claim. After centuries, the hold of the curse on us is finally starting to fade, and we will not be forced from our home again. This house you call your home, yours, sits on land that was never truly your right to claim, as do all the houses nearby. We may not have been able to successfully infiltrate the others yet, but it is only a matter of time. As the curse weakens and our own power grows, we've already set up agents at several other homes, and we have ways of accelerating the growth of our power further. We strongly suggest that you leave and never come back, and convince as many of your neighbors as you can to follow suit. No mercy will be shown to stragglers." The possible implications of the ways of accelerating
comment had gone way over my head, but not Arabelle's. Wait, did you say that one of the gnomes tried to attack the child next door? She asked me. Yes, I said, as the horror of realization settled over me. Wait, you all were going to sacrifice Lucy? I shouted at the gathering gnomes. No voice appeared in my head to confirm or deny my accusation, as the gnomes continued to wordlessly stare at the three of us. Father Jacob pulled out a vial of holy water and swiftly flung it in the nearest gnome. Nothing happened. Damn it, said Father Jacob. This was clearly going nowhere. I then decided to look around again at them, as I wondered what to try next, only to see that garden gnomes now stood all around the three of us, apparently having moved in while we all were paying our attention to the monarch. The inability to move or react while observed gave me another idea. I quickly turned to Arabelle and told her to watch the area behind us as I turned back to face the gnome's leader. Well, no matter who it rightfully or originally belongs to, I want my house back, and will do anything necessary to get it back, I said, trying to sound more intimidating than I'm sure I came off as. We both know you can't move while being seen, which means we both know there's nothing to stop me from walking over there and simply shattering you one by one as my friends here watch my back. I glanced beside me as Father Jacob gave a quick, clear nod of agreement. But to my consternation, Arabelle protested my threat. You can't just slaughter all of them. Vicious as they are sentient beings. That would be mass murder. They want to sacrifice Lucy, and even murder every person in the entire neighborhood if need be, I responded angrily. Better them than us. No, that kind of violent, over-the-top thinking is exactly what caused all of this in the first place. I can't let you slaughter them. I turned to Father Jacob and told him to turn and watch our backs like Arabelle had been, and then turned back and pleaded to Arabelle one last time not to stop me, but a gnome's voice popped in our heads, interrupting my pleas. It's no use. She will not allow you to kill us, and will even stop you if you try. We can see the truth of this in her mind. I turned to her and saw her jaw set firm as she let her silence indicate agreement. And now, friends, I hope you won't judge me too harshly for this next part. But I truly felt it necessary at the time, because once I saw Arabelle wouldn't budge from what she felt she must do, I knew I couldn't either. I'm willing to incapacitate her first, I said to the shock of the silence of everyone present. You can read our minds. Check now and see if I mean what I say. After a few seconds, Father Jacob sighed and said, I will keep watching your back, Eugene, whatever happens. Arabelle said nothing, only staring at me with a cold and defiant gaze. A gnome voice popped in. You won't get all of us, you know. You can't watch every bit of your surroundings indefinitely. All it takes is 1 second where one of you doesn't turn in time with the others, or has its vision obstructed, shall we say. I didn't pause to ponder how the gnomes might obstruct mine or Father Jacob's vision. I just immediately replied, well, I'm still willing to try, and I bet I can definitely kill a lot of you. The gnomes seemed to consider the circumstances for a few seconds before the main gnome voice appeared again in my brain. It appears we are at an impasse. Luckily, we gnomes, as you call us, are more patient than you humans. The ground beneath us began to tremble violently. I flew to the ground as the tremors increased, as I started to get the distinct sense of sinking somehow. What's going on? Professor Reynolds asked as I dropped the phone. I was wondering myself, but Arabelle answered the question. I think they're sinking the house. We have to leave now. But this could be our only chance to stop them, I shouted back. They're right, you can't get all of them, and if we die down here, who's going to warn your neighbors? That convinced me. I wasn't even sure how I'd convince all of them to leave. An old man knocking on doors to warn neighbors to leave or get killed in an impending invasion of gnomes didn't sound like an easy sell. But I knew I had to try, in case the gnomes stuck to their guns in this. All right, I said, and followed her towards the front door as Father Jacob walked behind her, More stumbled backwards, really, after us. We opened the door to see the house already sunken almost a story below ground, with the edges of my imploded lawn looking like a hill during a landslide. The three of us scrambled our way up the ever-steepening hill, not even looking back to see if any of the gnomes followed us. We were able to just make it to the edge of the lawn as the loud rumbling behind us reached a crescendo, and we turned to see my house fall fully below ground. Dirt and earth began to pour into the depression from the sides of the now almost 90-degree walls of the depression at the edge of my property. We could only watch in horror and amazement as the earth swallowed my home, and soon all that was left was a shallow depression of loose earth and upturned dirt that looked like an aftermath of some strange disaster. I looked over across the cul-de-sac, only to see Lucy staring from her bike, mouth agape. She appeared to be the only one that have seen the actual event, though I imagine at least a few other people would soon be coming out of their homes to see what the hell had made that loud noise. Without a word, Arabelle turned and started to walk over to her car. I called after her. "Arabelle, you tried to kill me with a hammer," she interrupted. "Not kill. Incapacitate," I started to respond. "I was only going to knock you unconscious, only for a few minutes, hopefully." I stopped after I saw she had already turned back around wordlessly and was already getting into her vehicle. "He'll be all right. She'll get over it, Mr. Eugene," said Lucy as she rode her bike up to me. I wondered at both the sound of her confidence in such a claim, as well as the lack of concern over the accusation of my attempted murder by hammer, but before I could decide whether or not to ask either or both points, she asked the obvious question. "So, what just happened to your house?" I tried to explain as much as comprehensively as I could, but I don't think I was in the clearest state of mind. Certainly was a much less comprehensive account than I would have written here. I do apologize for the delay, by the way, but since this all happened, I've been so busy trying to salvage things. Everyone from the neighbors to the police to my insurance company has been reaching out to me, seemingly night and day, to find out what happened. And what do I even tell them? Any photo evidence of proof of the truth would have been buried with my smartphone device after I'd dropped it in the house. But I can't think of a remotely believable, sanitized, or even false but believable version of events. So I mainly just stick to pretending I have no idea what happened, just being as baffled as those who ask me. Professor Reynolds is pretending to have no participation in the events, and I haven't really pushed hard against because, honestly, I don't blame her. Arabelle refuses or ignores any attempt at contact, which also seems fair enough. Father Jacob has extended his support to me and made it clear to reach out to him if I need anything, and that he'll vouch for me as need. I don't think he'll take him up on that for some reason. I moved to an extended stay hotel rather than accept my daughter's offer to move in with her and her husband for a bit. That reason is I don't want to get anyone involved in what happens next if they don't have to be. You see, my friends, I can't shake everything the gnomes told me and pretend that because my house is gone, that they are too. Even after I saw that the scattered gnomes in my yard, the agents, as they are referred to by the king, had all disappeared shortly after the implosion of my property. Because I know it might all be too temporary. Just before the gnomes began to sink my house into the earth, one of the gnomes had said that gnomes are more patient than you humans. I don't think they've given up on the plans at local domination. I just put them on pause. And probably a relatively short one at that. I'm not going to sit around and do nothing while I wait for that to happen. Better for my neighbors to lose their homes than their lives. So I've been researching my options for forcing a relatively permanent evacuation of my neighborhood. Toxic waste I can produce from the dark web, and bombs, carefully targeting arson, those kinds of things. I wouldn't share exactly what I settled on, but so as not to unnecessarily implicate myself any further than I already have. As such, it's probably just going to be my last update, since any advice I might need likely be better suited for a different forum, so to speak. But I do want you all to know how much of help you all have been to this poor old man, because at his wit's end. Without you all, who knows what would have happened. I might have been institutionalized or abandoned my home to never return and just let the garden gnomes kill everyone in the neighborhood. Instead, I had faced the invaders, and now I'm ready to do what still needs to be done. No matter the consequences. Warmest regards. Eugene.
Hey there kids, it's me, MrCreepyPasta, and I want to tell you thank you so much for watching tonight's video or listening to tonight's episode of the podcast. I really appreciate it, and anytime you guys give me a subscribe or a follow or a like or a comment or literally just a watch, I can't thank you enough for it, because you're the reason I keep making episodes, and you guys are the reason that I love horror as much as I do. It's the middle of summer, and I'm sure you guys have summer reading lists or something like that, but wouldn't it be cooler if I just read to you? So, you can always check me out on Audible, audible.com. You can search up MrCreepyPasta, and I have a whole bunch of books that I've done audiobooks for there, such as Tales from the Gas Station, or the very newest one that I've done, Pastel-Colored Dreams and Human-Flavored Nightmares by Vincent Venicava. If you haven't checked that out yet, hot dang, you should. And as always, I want to give a very special thanks to all of my patrons at patreon.com/MrCreepyPasta, because you guys are the reasons I get to keep my lights on in the house and get wonderful little treats for my cats and everything like that. And also the reason why we keep getting special custom series just for the channel. So a special thanks to Jacob Shaffer, Jordan Alexander Sanchez, Bryon, Arce, Ken Lando Higuchi, Bobby Karman, Tristain, Pelton, Chase Burnett, Bardo Hawk 764, TheBananaMafia 1, Melancholy Corpse, Hollow Zero, Ferb, Harley, Billy Morrow, Katie Birch, Sashi Sazaku, Kayden the Spooky Boy, MyBodySoundsLikeRiceKrispys, AshWood, Lord of the Weebs, Jay, Feyelocket, Miss Xandra, MrUnsettlingSpaghetti, Eurogore, Suji Campbell, Marco Takes Dabs 420, Stricken, Ozarine Fox, Robert White, Andres Garcia, Snails Brennan, Legit Quad Feed, James Bruce, Chris Lovins, Freddy Krueger, Tynan, Justin Johnson, Michael Scarborough, Infernal One, James Lowe, Lisa Cottrell, Caspian, Jordan Els, Hades Nephew, Tater Chip, Acid System, Prozac and Pancake Appreciation Society, Cryptic Nightmares, Someone You Love, Kiri the Sloth, Tommy Green, Sky Harbor, Caleb Dougal, Nina Smith, Nico Kyle, Rafael Rodriguez, The Ginger Bros, Aaron Stormcrow, Daniel Polson, Trace Miles, Corey Kenshin, and Peaceful Buddha. That's right, guys, at patreon.com/MrCreepyPasta, you could join this amazing list of people's names I mispronounce and the list of Patreons down there in the description. But of course, none of that is ever required. I just appreciate you guys subscribing and watching and honestly being here. So all of you, sweet dreams.